Good morning, sunshines. So today we're going to talk about fabrics and how to sew them and how to create them and how to use them. Again, there are 6 things that make for materials that we use in theater. One of them is cheap, available, all those things, and safe, reliable, dependable. Fabrics are all those things. They, again, are sometimes a way, if you have styrofoam, which we'll talk about in a couple of weeks, that's a way of coating styrofoam to make it less peelable, that sort of thing. So you can use fabrics in many ways in order to create the environment that you're after, including having drapes, having fabrics that use to create the legs and the borders and all that sort of stuff for the drops in the theater. Let's just talk about how to make fabric. First of all, to make fabric, you need a loom. And of course, the size of the loom will tell you the size of the fabric. The customary size in America of most looms is 44 to 45 inches. Now, one of the things about the loom, the first thing you're gonna do is you're gonna need some sort of material like cotton, like polyester, like linen. Again, they're all different kind of flax, different kinds of materials that are spun into threads. And then those threads are put through the loom. Now the loom is gonna have several parts to it. One of the most important parts of the reeds, which separate the weft, separate the warp threads. And then you're gonna have a picker that will alternately pick and lower the warp threads as you send a shuttle through to give you gives your weft thread. So you're gonna have several warp threads that are then going to be woven with the machine so that the thread actually goes under one warp thread, over the next, under the next, and over the next. And then by lowering the picker, you'll have send the shuttle back through and have your weft thread that'll then be over the next one, under the next one, over the next one, under the next one. And then it alternates and you create fabric, yes? Through this means of using a loom, going over and under the warp threads, using a shuttle to send the weft strands through. Now in the olden days, the shuttle was a literal stick that was just tied, the thread was tied to the stick and it was just sent along. Nowadays, these huge machines make these fabrics, and they're going to have huge spools that will be sent from each of the warp threads into this loom. More expensive fabrics often are not made of finer materials necessarily, although if you had a 45-inch piece of silk and a 45-inch piece of cotton, because cotton in America is more available and silk is less available, the silk fabric will be more. Oftentimes the width of the fabric, because you're going to have fewer and fewer looms that produce 72-inch wide fabric or produce 108-inch wide fabric, etc., 120-inch wide fabric. So if you need wider looms, and for instance, if you're using a full stage scrim, we'll talk about what scrim is later, but if you're using a full stage scrim that can't have a seam in it, you have to have a loom that's at least 20 feet wide to create that, and those only exist in Europe. And so while the material is still just cotton, the way it is woven into make the fabric, because the loom has got to be so wide and there's so few of them, causes the cost of the fabric to skyrocket. Yes. So again, there are several factors that go into creating the price of fabrics. Here's a little video showing you how fabric construction, how it happens in a major manufacturing facility today.
Fabric is made from thousands of braided threads. This mill has 700 bobbins of polyester. Each bobbin contains 250,000 meters of thread. We begin by separating the threads. This warp unit takes the 700 strands and assembles them. Then this comb separates them. Other strands are added, and in total, there will be 7,000 of them well aligned. One fabric is composed of threads braided at 90 degrees. The warp threads are assembled lengthwise, while the weft threads are joined transversely. To prevent the threads from tearing, they pass through a bin of glue. These rollers eliminate the surplus. The glue will be removed with water before dyeing the threads. The glued together threads exit this machine. These large green cylinders are heated and dry the glue on the threads. Knitting will soon begin. The 700 strands are newly separated on this loom roller. Each thread must pass through a blade to produce a specific design. This machine takes the 7,000 strands of thread, one by one, and they pass through the blade. It's a highly precise operation. The threads pass through a blade, and the weaving finally begins. On this Jacquard-type loom roller, the warp thread is inserted by a jet of air. The weaving machine assembles 2 loom rollers made of 7,000 strands. The fabric reaches a width of 3.65 meters. The dart threads are inserted into the weave. They insert 600 weft strands per minute. The blades remove the weft strands to insert the warp ones between the two. A comb pushes the weft. The plate of the breakage chain stops the machine should a thread break. This bobbin contains 250,000 meters of thread. That's 250 kilometers. The weft thread is in the insertion nozzle. When a weft is inserted, an air jet nudges it in. The loom roller operates at full tilt. It makes 600 thread intersections a minute. Weaving is now over. We move on to the following steps: washing and dyeing. Washing is done in a soapy solution at 80 degrees in a continuous manner at a speed of 60 meters of fabric a minute. The fabric is rinsed in clear water of about 30 degrees. Now it's on to dyeing. This is done with jets. Up to 12,000 meters of fabric are placed in clean water into which colorants have been added. The solution is heated and the fabric soaks here for about 6 hours. Then it will be rinsed in lukewarm water. The fabric is placed in a bin. This machine is called an opener. It unfolds and stretches the material before rolling it up on an immense roller. And now the roll is almost full. We now move to thermosetting in a high-temperature oven which dries the fabric. The temperature is 200 degrees centigrade at the oven's entrance. The fabric circulates here for 45 seconds. This finished roll weighs 1,500 kilos. The bobbin that we saw at the beginning has produced 25 kilometers of fabric.
After the fabric is created, you can change the color by adding dyes to the fabric, and that'll create different colored fabrics. You can also create prints by dyeing things, or you can create prints by having the weave be in the fabric. I'll show you both those things in just a moment. So what we want to do now is I'm going to go and we're going to cut to various pieces of fabric and talk about how each one is made and the difference between it and the next piece of fabric. So we'll join in a second. Excellent. So I'm going to introduce you to several types of fabric, talk about what they are and approximately how much they cost. The first most common type of fabric we use more often than any other in theater is muslin. There are 3 different types of muslin. There's lightweight, heavyweight, and medium weight. Light, medium, and heavy, there you go. Which again, the way you create that, but by creating more and less strands per square inch. And if you look closely, you can see the weft. And again, you can see on the edge how it's a little flare there. That's the selvage. The selvage is the turn back at the end. And when you rip that off, it creates an open end that can be nicely feathered down into create less seams between fabrics, yes? Now, of course, you can take muslin and you can dye it blue or yellow or pink or whatever colors you want to. So it's a very durable fabric. It's a very inexpensive fabric. A 72-inch wide piece of muslin is going to cost you about $4 a yard, which is not square yard, just linear yard. Then the next thing we have here is what's called duck. Again, it's a little bit taking muslin cotton fibers and weaving them. You have the strands are sort of wider, and then you weave those the same way. I think it's very easy to see the weft and the warp here, and you can see the edges have not been selvaged, so they're just open to the end. It's trying to create the thickness of canvas. Canvas is what we use to make tents with. I don't know if you've ever been camping and tried to touch or accidentally touch the tent with your finger, and the oil in your finger will bring the moisture through the canvas. But canvas is made of linen, and so it is naturally repellent to water, resists water. And so one of the nice things about canvas is you can use it, a lot of times it's used for floor coverings, that sort of thing, because it's a lot more durable when people walk on it than this duck or the muslin. Yes? Now the curtains are often mostly made of what's called velour. Again, this is a nice piece of velour. One of the things about velour is still just a weft and a warp weave, but each of the warp strands has a little loop to it. It sticks out from the fabric just a little bit, which creates what's called a nap, which creates a thickness to it, and if you can change directions to it very quickly. Again, velour, let's see here, how much does it cost? It's rather more expensive. It costs about $17 a yard because, again, of the width of it. You don't want, your curtains are going to be 10 foot wide, and so the loom that you need for that is going to be much more expensive. A cheaper version of velour is what's called duvetine. Duvetine is, again, 100% cotton, but it's made with the nap is a little thinner. Again, this is a black piece of duvetine. They also have this stuff called commando cloth, which is often used for fabrics, that sort of thing. And then another type used for fabrics is what's called, it's got a herringbone pattern in it. I don't know if you can see the weave of the pattern, but that's woven into it, and it helps collect the light. So these are often used for curtains in the theater, yes? And then the last thing before we turn around, this is shark's tooth scrim. This stuff, again, it runs about 30 foot wide piece of this, which is a normal size. It will cost you about $100 a yard. So it's a 30 foot wide piece that you can order as long as you need it at $100 a yard. But you can see that it's a open weave, and the way it works, if you light this side of the scrim, it opaques. You can't really see my arm. But if you light the other side, and again, I don't have lighting to do that with, but here's a little video showing you how scrim works.
It was a cold and windy night, and the hero of our story was waiting for a friend on a dark and eerie street corner. Alone. Or was he? No. Behind our hero was a dangerous villain. Where had she come from?
Well, she'd been there the whole time. She was standing behind a scrim. A scrim is a special type of fabric that can be translucent, transparent, or opaque depending on how it's lit. In theater, lighting designers use a scrim to hide something or someone until the exact moment they want us to see it.
Scrims are used to create all kinds of moods and effects, from scary to dreamy to surprising. All you have to do to change that effect is use different lighting implements on that scrim. So, if our hero wants to escape the dangerous villainess, all he has to do is shed different light on the scrim to make her disappear.
Will she return? Who knows?
Now the last curtain in the theater is usually a white piece of fabric called a cyclorama, and it is made the same way that a scrim is made, except they take one extra piece of cotton fabric or cotton thread, and they weave it into the hole. And what that does, it creates a fabric that is very luminescent when you light it, and so it reflects light very vividly. You can have a nice sharp image on it, and it'll project that or reflect that very nicely. But that's what's called a filled scrim, and it's about $120 a yard, and it's why cycloramas are so expensive, because again, a cyclorama, you can't have a seam in it. So again, you're talking about a loom that is at least 25, 30 foot wide that creates that piece of fabric. Now, the cheapest fabric, going from the more expensive to the least expensive, cheesecloth. Cheesecloth is used, it's a very loose weave, still cotton, but it's a very loose weave. You can even see very clearly the weft and the warp there. But it's used to drain the water off of cheese, which is why it's called cheesecloth. But what we use it in theater is to cover things like styrofoam, to give it some strength to the styrofoam. We also use it if we need to, sometimes we'll paint with it and create little patterns with it and that sort of stuff, but it's very lightweight. And again, it can be used in a variety of different ways. Now, one of the more expensive fabrics is silk. This is an example of silk. Silk is made, I'm not trying to be too graphic here, but silk is the residue of silkworms that you then take the strand and it creates a very fine thread, very strong, very fine thread. And then they're woven together to create these very rich, luscious fabrics called silk. Now you can, depending on how finely you pull the thread, will determine the sheen of the silk. Here's a little video showing you how silk is made.
Silk fabric originated in China at least 5,000 years ago and became a coveted luxury. Silk thread is produced by silkworms when they make their cocoons. Sericulture, or commercially breeding silkworms for silk production, is practiced in several Asian countries. From home goods to accessories and clothing, there are few textiles as elegant and luxurious or as prized throughout the ages as silk. It's hard to believe this beautiful fabric comes from worms. The female silkworm lays up to 400 eggs in one shot, then promptly dies. Each egg, about 2 weeks later, hatches into a larva. The larva feeds on fresh mulberry leaves continuously, increasing its body weight 10,000-fold and growing to a length of about 3 inches. Then, as it enters the pupa phase of its life cycle, it excretes liquid raw silk from salivary glands in its mouth. When that liquid silk contacts with the air, it hardens into a single thread. Pupating larva winds that thread around itself into a thick, cozy cocoon. Normally, the pupa inside becomes a moth, and the cocoon breaks as it emerges. However, this severs the continuous silk thread, so to keep the thread intact, they boiled the cocoon for about 3 minutes to kill the pupa inside before it transforms into a moth. Boiling the cocoons also makes the wound thread easier to unravel by melting away most of the sericin, the gelatinous protein that binds it. To harvest the silk, they take threads from 30 to 50 cocoons at a time. They feed them all together through a hole in the bamboo stick onto a hand-operated reel. Then, slowly and carefully, they turn the reel, unraveling the cocoons. As the thread passes together through the stick, the remaining sericin glues them together, forming a single thicker thread. The silk threads coming together are so fine, only about 1/100th of a millimeter in diameter, that it takes 2,000 to 3,000 cocoons to produce a pound of silk thread. Unraveling cocoons is a time-consuming process because a single thread can be as long as 9 professional soccer fields. To make this feather-like silk thread easier to handle, they weigh it down with sand before rolling it into a bundle. Next, they wash away the sand and remaining sericin, then bleach the thread so it will uniformly absorb the synthetic dye. It's critical to monitor the ratio of dye to hot water, as well as water temperature and soaking time, as all these factors combined affect the quality of the color. After rinsing away the excess dye with lukewarm water, they hang the thread to dry. They mount the bundles of dry dyed silk thread on a big machine, which transfers them to smaller rollers. Those rollers then go on an automated machine, which transfers the thread to small bobbins. To craft silk fabric, weavers will pass bobbins of thread horizontally between vertical threads on a traditional hand-operated loom. Another machine, meanwhile, winds thread around spools. A worker then installs a set number of spool threads on a mechanism, which aligns them vertically on the loom, parallel to each other. Fabric that's about 3 feet wide typically requires 4,000 vertical threads. By stepping on the loom's foot pedal, the weaver repeatedly raises every second vertical thread, and with a tug of a cord, passes a shuttle containing a bobbin of thread horizontally in between. This intertwining of horizontal and vertical threads weaves the silk fabric. To create a pattern, the weaver uses multiple shuttles containing threads of different colors, thicknesses, and textures. Some patterns, such as an intricate weave called brocade, are so intricate that even the most experienced weavers produce just 2 to 6 inches of fabric per day. Now that's wearable art.
All right, so again, as you, with any fabric, silks they just showed you, you can do one of two things to create patterns. One is to stamp the pattern onto it, and the way you know it's stamped is on the back side. You don't see the colors. So that fabric has just been sent through and just basically painted on one side with the dye. You can also send it through the loom, and as you see with this piece, everything alternates. So that on one side you have the gray with the blue, on the other side you have the blue with gray. But this has been woven into it. Again, you can do flowers or anything you want to, whatever pattern you want, as they showed you in that video just a second ago. Now, there are a whole lot of different variety of fabrics that are attempting to recreate what silk does, because silk, being from silkworms and being from India mostly, is very expensive, as you might guess, especially in large quantities. And so you have a whole variety of fabrics that are attempting to make that sheen. This is chiffon, which is flimsy, it's lightweight, it's made out of nylon, it's a plastic. And you can see that as it gets to the end, it doesn't tear nice. Any kind of cotton fabric that you have, when you rip it, it tears across the grain. Anytime you have any kind of polyester fabric, when you try and rip it, it just doesn't rip. It's just not nice. But chiffon is very nice. This is organza, which again is a little bit lighter weight. It is hard to put you can see the selvage here and how they've gone back and doubled back to stop the edge from slipping. But you can see there's a little moire effect to it. What I'm calling it. If you look at my fingers, you can see there's a little lines that are created there. And so anytime you're using any kind of organza, if that's something you want, it's something you're gonna get, whether you want it or not. So be aware that it can create the nice sheen of silk for a lot less money, but it does have that repercussion. This stuff is called bobinette. There are several types. If you've ever heard of tulle, T-U-L-L-E, it's often used on wedding gowns and wedding headdresses, that sort of thing. This is sort of a loose weave fabric. You can use it much like Scrim, but you can also use it like cheesecloth to cover stuff. But this is all, bobinette is made of 100% cotton, and it's fairly cheap. It's about $3 a yard, depending on how thick it is. This stuff is called flannel, which again, it's made the same way that we talked about when we talked about velour, only it's a lot smaller little pull-throughs. But flannel, if you've never felt velour, flannel is a cheap man's velour. So that's what flannel is all about. Cool. All right, let's talk about sewing machines and how to put all this stuff together.
You know something, guys, when I first started doing tailoring videos, I should have showed you how to use the sewing machine from start to finish. And that's something that I haven't done. I've kind of glanced over that detail, which is very important. So right there behind me, I have a sewing machine, my sewing machine that I use to do all of my work. It's very basic. It is a Brother LX3817. You could get it at Walmart or on Amazon. It's a great basic sewing machine, and today I'm going to show you how to use it. So guys, walking around the sewing machine, the first thing that we're going to have, which is kind of the most bold thing, is going to be this big knob on the front. And this knob is going to be the pattern selection dial. This allows you to customize the type of stitch that you're sewing. So if you want to do like a straight stitch or a zigzag stitch, this is going to be where you decide to choose what pattern you're going to be sewing. The sewing machine that I have here today happens to be one that has probably about 11 different stitch patterns on there, so you have a bunch of different options. This machine also allows you to do buttonholes as well, which is something that's important, but you'll have to get an adapter for that. Right below the pattern selection dial, you have the reverse lever, and what this does is good for locking in your stitch. So if you're doing, say, a straight stitch, you're going to use this reverse lever to lock in your stitch. And then moving to the left, the smaller dial on here is going to be your upper thread tension control. Now, I don't ever really adjust this, I leave it on 0, but I think this has something to do with the tension of the thread. It's something that I've never really bothered, and it hasn't stopped me from being able to sew things like pants or shirts, so I really don't know much about this, so just for now on, leave that at a 0. Moving up to the top of the sewing machine, you have the bobbin winder. What this is responsible for is winding the small bobbin that's going to go underneath the needle, underneath the sewing machine. This is super important because you want to wind this up correctly. It's going to allow for a tight wind, and that's going to go better in the bottom where you put the bobbin in. Speaking of the lower thread holder, we're going to take you down there. It's just basically there's a little plastic cover over it. In here in this hole, you put the bobbin in there and then basically wrap it around the hook, and then it's going to line it up, and then you put the excess thread to the side. And this basically, when you lower the needle down with the wind on the side, it's going to fetch some of that thread and bring it back up into the material, and then you're going to be able to start sewing. And then finally, what you have on the sewing machine down at the bottom on the floor is going to be just a motor. It's like a pedal. You press it like it's a car, and it's going to make the sewing machine start to move and start to sew. So now we're at the sewing machine, and we're going to look at how to set up this sewing machine. I'm going to walk you through step by step so that you have a really good grasp on how to use this. So first thing, we're going to put this thread up here. So while we've got this up here, and I'm going to flip this around, I'm going to put it through there, bring it through this little doohickey right here. I don't know if you can see it that well. And then we're going to wrap it around, bring it back over, grab our bobbin, thread the bobbin, set that up right there, and then press the pedal, and that's basically going to wind. Once the bobbin is winded up, then you're going to basically just take it off of there and cut the excess thread, and then this is ready to go underneath down here. So take your bobbin, then you're going to place it down here and there, and then there's a little hook. If I can get this to go through, basically hook it over and lay it to the side, and then that's good down there. Here, I'll take a closer look. So this is where that bobbin went, and then the thread comes out through there. There's a little hook in there that you can't see. Now, moving up here, you're going to still take your thread, run it through this little thing right here. Then you're going to bring that down. Then put the thread through the needle. This is the hardest part, to be honest. So it's the hardest part, but I got it through there. And then we're going to also put the little cover back on there. So you could see we got this needle all set up. Now you just take your fabric. We're just going to test and put some under here. And you're going to lower this with the lever on the side down into the fabric. And it's going to pull up some fabric, and then you're going to be ready to sew. So now just make sure you go in a straight line or whatever you do. Then you sew. Then you use your reverse on the side. You can lock it in and then keep sewing. And then move this little thread out of the way. Then once you get done, you lift the lever foot back here, and then you raise the needle, pull your fabric out. Then you're going to have just a very basic stitch. It's going to show on both sides, as you can see. And that's pretty much all there is to it. You just got to know what to sew with the sewing machine. Just again, another rundown. This right here is going to be your pattern selection. This is the reverse lever. This is your thread tensioning. And then you also have the bobbin, or the spool of thread up here. This is your bobbin winder over here. And then the thread is going to come through here when you're getting ready to sew. It's going to go down through here, then up around there, and there's a little hook in there that you have to hook it around. Then you bring it through to your needle. Over on the side, this is your, I forgot the name, I just call it like a roller. This allows you to control the needle. And so that's basically all there is to using your sewing machine. I wish you the best of luck. This is just a simple straight stitch, as you can see, but there's a lot of different other options, and I wish you the best. So guys, that's
Great. A couple terms I want to point out from the video. just to put them in your notes, but also to reiterate them. First of all, the thread is on a spool. So the spool is going to be something that you just buy the individual thread on, and you can change that. And you need to, well, underneath the machine is what's called a bobbin. And that's the thread that goes, as the needle goes into the fabric, the bobbin is what keeps it from pulling back out of the fabric. There's another needle that goes sideways as the one needle that you see goes in and out. There's another one that pushes the bobbin through and back. And if you want the thread to be the same as the bobbin, you have to put the same color thread on the bobbin. Now, sometimes it doesn't matter if you're just doing stuff quick and dirty. And so having just any color bobbin in the machine is fine. But again, one of the things that is going to invariably happen as you sew large things like drops and things is you're going to get about halfway through and the bobbin's going to run out, which can be very frustrating because you think you're finished a whole line of straight stitching, and you find out about halfway through the bobbin gave out. So you have to pay attention to that as just a warning. Another stitch we often use is the zigzag stitch, which again is just a way to adjust the machine there to create a pattern instead of straight lines that goes back and forth. It creates a stronger stitch. So if you have something that's going to be under pressure, people are going to be pulling on it, tugging on it, having that zigzag stitch can add strength to the garment or to the piece fabric, whatever you're creating. You should always have a seam allowance. The seam allowance typically is 5/8 of an inch. Not always, but typically you have 5/8 on both pieces so that you have enough a little fabric there left over. And a lot of shirts, one of the ways you can alter them is because you have a little seam allowance. You can sort of create a little extra seam allowance to take a little out, but that's one of the reasons it's there, but also so you're not sewing on the side of the fabric. And then the pressure foot. The pressure foot is the part of the machine that you lower that actually, there's again, a couple of feet below that sort of help the fabric through. But again, you're sort of moving with your hands as well. So the machine and you're working in concert as you use the foot pedal to create the sewing effect. Yes. So again, sewing is something it's a skill. It's something that I would encourage you, if you've never done it before, to at least try. You're going to find that some people respond very well to sewing. Some people, though, it can be daunting. But again, here's a little picture with a sewing machine. I'm just going to point out the major parts. You got the bobbin underneath and the bobbin case. Again, there's a little pull-up thing, a little tab that you pull up and pull the case and the bobbin out together. And then when you let go of the tab, it lets the bobbin release. And then you fill it up there. See up there where it says bobbin winder at the very top. You're going to take you're going to disconnect. There's a way to turn the balance wheel so that it disconnects, so you can then fill your bobbin and then reconnect your balance wheel so that the needle is connected, and put your bobbin back in underneath the machine. Again, you have your needle. Make sure that the needle has a front side that needs to be facing forward. It's got a little groove in it. Otherwise, your needle is going to constantly cut your thread. The pressure foot always needs to be lowered. I can't tell you the number of times where I've seen people sewing with a pressure foot that is raised. Again, the take-up thread goes up and down constantly. You're just pulling more thread through to anticipate the needle going down, that sort of stuff. You see there's a little selector switch that again, if you're using a straight seam, it'll determine how far away each needlework thing is. But between the stitch selection panel, the width and the length, you can create your zigzag. Yes. If you have the width at 0, then all you're doing is correcting the length, so you can go from a very tight thread. Again, the tighter the thread, the stronger the seam. But if you're just putting two things together that aren't going to get, it's just, if you're doing for instance, a mock-up where you're going to take it apart probably anyway, don't use a tight thread, a seam. You want to use a loose seam because you're going to cut it all apart anyway. Then you have your foot pedal, of course, is usually below the table that you're working on. Yes? Cool. One of the things you can also use when you're using fabric is a serger. Again, I've shown you several different fabrics that have their selvage torn off. What a serger will do, it'll add this little fabric turn at the end, this thread turn at the end, and you'll see there'll be a little serger left over. Cut that off. But that's what a serger will do. It'll create a little end so that it doesn't unravel at the end of your fabrics. And so this is very nice if you've already done your mock-up and you know what size you want to cut your pieces to, then you can use a serger to create, to end it so it doesn't unravel any further. Here's a little video on how to use a serger.
There comes a time when every sewer wants to elevate her creations. And when that time comes, it's time to add a serger to your sewing room. Brother offers its best and most affordable serger yet in the 1034D. Ideal for creating ruffles and sewing decorative and finishing stitches on linens, formal wear, and stretchy fabric, this 3/4 serger delivers an impressive range of features often found on much more expensive models. First, the 1034D is very easy to thread. The machine has easy-to-follow lay-in threading and a powerful tension disc release which helps assure accurate thread placement in the tension discs. And the fast lower looper threading system couldn't be easier. It's color-coded and designed to make sure the thread stays right in place. Customers who have the 1034D rave about the differential feed too. The feed helps improve results when sewing stretchy, knitted, or thin fabrics, and also helps prevent the wavy or stretched appearance of stitches on fabrics that lower quality sergers may deliver. You can use a 1034D on virtually all types of weights of fabric, including silk and denim. Unlike some sergers, the 1034D has a removable free arm, which is a big help when you're serging cylindrical items like pant legs, as well as a retractable knife, which helps prevent accidentally cutting your fabric when working close to the edges of rolled hems. The 1034D also comes with a full range of accessories, including a number of snap-on presser feet which are easy to change. Watch as the feet snap on with ease. Nothing could be simpler. Perfection in your sewing comes at a price, an affordable one, with the 1034D. To learn more, visit brother-usa.com.
Great. Now, another thing you can use to create, if you don't have a serger, you can use these things called pinking shears, which are scissors that have a little serrated edge that sort of gives you that cut right there. And you can see that there are no extra strings hanging off of this. God knows how long I've had this in my fabric bag, but it cuts the edge and it keeps the fabric from unwinding, and it gives you that little shape at the end. But those are called pinking shears. Really, you don't need. We can't do both, because if you use the pinking shears and then use the serger is going to cut off whatever you have pinked. So that won't even work. Here's a big wake up. Yes, you wake. Chris, you wake. Do not ever use anybody's fabric scissors for anything else other than cutting fabric. As a matter of fact, if you're in a costume shop and somebody's fabric scissors are sitting there, and usually they will have a piece of fabric tied to it that is their own personal fabric, but you will be killed. You will be dead if you use somebody's fabric scissors for something other than cutting fabric. And even then, I would double take if somebody said I could use their fabric scissors even to cut my own fabric. Those things are sharpened and are the possessions of the stitchers and the cutters, and they are very valuable things. So I tease you not. That is something you could be killed for. All right, the first day of class or the second day of class, we watched a video talking about the legs and borders. Again, the legs are the horizontal members of the masking. The borders are the vertical members of the masking. The first set of legs are what are called tormentors. The first border is what's called a teaser, and those typically are colored like if you, whatever the color of the university is. So at Auburn, they're blue, right now they're orange, I think, but they're orange or blue fabric because those typically are the colors of the university. At West Virginia University, the color of the Grand Drape and the tormentors and teasers are all that bright yellow color, which is very nice on the eye. But one of the things about these, any kind of drapes or drops, again, drops are just pieces of muslin that have been painted with scenery on them. Whenever you have a drop, full stage drop is, of course, covers the entire stage. The seams want to be vertical seams. They want to go across the drop, in other words, so that way they can pull down with the weight of the curtain. You don't want to have horizontal seams because then they'll just catch the light wrong. But in the very top of the fabric, you want to use this stuff called jute webbing. Jute is a very, it's made out of flax, and it's very strong fabric. And if you punch grommet holes through them, a grommet is merely a hole that is reinforced with a piece of metal, a grommet, and then you put your tie through it and then tie it to your pipe. But that's the way you finish off the top end of any kind of leg, border, or drop, yes? Now, fabric you have the weft and you have the warp, yes? If you hang them on a diagonal, this is called the bias. The bias of the fabric is the 45-degree angle of the fabric, and the bias, if you were going to try and hang a nice drape, to have a nice draping effect, you want to hang it on the bias. So if you're creating a window pattern, you want to hang it straight and then pick it up, and then where it gets to 45 degrees, you'll have the nice billowy, fabric-y kind of look to it. But a lot of people will try and hang it the wrong way, and so that's the reason why, because you want the billows come from the bias, the release of the bias, yes? All right, when you're talking about drops, there are several different types of drops, just a full stage drop, but if you have any kind of opening in the drop that's been cut through, it's called a cut drop. Here's an example of an Egyptian set with a cut drop. Then the fourth stage there has what's called a framed drop or portal. Again, it's a scenic element that masks the offstage space. If you have, usually it's mylar, which we'll talk about when we talk about plastics next time. But if you have a kind of ribbon curtain, where you just have strips of fabric that hang down, that can be very exciting, and there's a little picture of a ribbon curtain drop. And again, we talked about the filled scrim earlier, using for the cyclorama. So there's an example of a show with a cyclorama that has the blue night sky with the clouds on it with the moon shining bright. And you can see how reflective that filled scrim is. So again, today we talk about fabrics. Fabrics can be a very cheap, effective, innovative way of creating sets on the go. The nice thing is they fold up and fit in a suitcase, and so they're transportable. If you have a show that's on tour, they can be reproduced very easily. If you tear them or rip them, you can fix them. And so fabric is always a good alternative, other than things like wood and steel, which again are heavier and more expensive and not necessarily available, as you can see. Now, again, certain scrims, certain wide fabrics can be expensive. And you want to be very careful with them in the way that they're treated. But fabrics can be a very viable option for a different way of, different material that you can use in the theater. Cool? All right, next time we're going to talk about plastics and adhesives. We'll see you then.